Hey guys, in this video we're going to talk about will the market crash? So come on. So there's this growing sentiment that of course the housing market is so hot and has gone up so much during the last couple of years especially that it's due to crash. And I kind of want to go over a little bit about why I believe it won't and give you guys some cold hard facts. Before I begin, I kind of want to talk about sort of why I believe this sentiment kind of is growing, right? Aside from the fact that the housing market is booming. I think it's a little bit of recency bias. It's human nature that we tend to remember or believe only what's been recent, right? The last time housing went up this much, it crashed. But if we look at housing historically, there really hasn't been a crash like the one we had 10, 12 years ago, whatever that may have been, like that ever. And so I kind of want to just go over some of the factors behind what drove that and what's driving this and how they differ. I would like for you guys to start thinking about building, right? When you build something going up, you start with the foundation. That is the most important thing. If you have a weak or compromised foundation, that building will eventually collapse. Most buildings that we build here in America don't collapse. They have a solid foundation, but they might have some construction defects, right? And so along the way, those construction defects tend to rear themselves. I would like to have people start thinking about the housing market in that way, where back in 08, 09, housing crash, and prior to that, obviously, while the housing boom was going on, there was a very weak foundation that was established, and then the housing was built on top of that. This time around, we have a much more solid foundation. So let's start here right off with inventory. As you guys can see here, 4 years of the housing crash on the left in orange, 2007 through 2010. We had the first 2 years over 9 months of housing supply, 7 and then 8 months of housing supply. You look at this go around in this housing quote unquote bubble, and we have at the highest month in 2018, 3.7 months of inventory, and we're currently sitting actually in 2022 at just 0.7 months of inventory. Next one is foreclosures. If you look at this here, you can clearly see that foreclosures are way down. We're at 151,000 as of 2021 compared to the housing peak right before the crash of 05 and 06. Even then, when housing was at its top dollar, foreclosures were at 500,000 and 700,000. So we're clearly nowhere near the level of foreclosures as we were before the housing crash and during the last housing peak. One of the biggest regulatory changes that came about from the market crash back in 08, 09 was regulatory standards for lending. And they got really strict because really back then they were allowing everyone almost to get a loan, it seemed like. They were lending money to people to buy houses who really couldn't afford them. On top of that, if you owned a home that you had bought just years back, you had a lot of equity, just like you do today. And they were allowing you to pull out equity from your home that was 105% of your home's value. So you were already underwater. And nobody saw the crash coming, and so a lot of people lost their homes. This time around, lending standards are extremely tight, as you can see here. In the red, you have 2003 to 2007. That was kind of like the peak of the last housing bubble. And you can see that the volume of loans in billions with a credit score of 620 or below, right? This is the amount of billions they were lending to people with a credit score of 620 or below. In red, super high, almost hit 400 billion there in 2006. Since then, you can see that they have really tightened that And as of 2021, I mean, we're sitting just at about 80 billion or so that were lent to people with a 620 credit score or below. What that really means is that you're going to have a less likelihood of anyone defaulting on their mortgage. So now let's take a look at housing prices. Let's go back to the 1950s, and so we can get about 70 years worth of information. Here you can see in the blue is what we want to take a look at, because the green is adjusted prices for inflation. But let's take a look at the blue. That gives us actual numbers for that time. Go back all the way to 1954, and you see up until the 1970s that home prices really sort of stay flat, right? In the 1970s, we have a big boom of housing and inflation, and it goes up. From then on, you really have a direct incline trajectory and home increase all the way up until about 2006, right before the last crash. I mean, that's a long time, guys. Really, no point do you have any sort of housing crash. I mean, there are a couple points there in the late 70s and in the late 80s where you have somewhat of a market correction, right? And this is what I was talking about earlier when we were talking about building. Like, when you build with a solid foundation, you might have some cracks and some construction defects that arise later on. And so with the housing, you might have some corrections naturally that happen over time, right? Supply and demand shifts, other factors within the economy that give you a bit of a correction. But we're talking about 10 to 15% correction. And if you just take a look at housing today, we were in Vegas up 30% over a year. Who knows what 2022 is going to bring, but if we're up 10 to 15%, now you're talking about 40 to 45% increase in the last couple of years. And if you're talking about a 10% decrease in a market correction, it really doesn't behoove anybody to wait simply to try and time the market for a quote unquote crash. Lastly, I kind of want to touch on equity again. Like I mentioned, last housing bubble, people were kind of using their homes as ATM machines and pulling out all their equity plus some. And so it left them in a lot of negative equity situations. And when housing went, kaput, everybody lost their homes. This time around, home refinances are actually at a third of what they were back then. So there's a lot of people that are not touching their homes in that way, leaving the equity in there, maintaining their sustainable mortgage payment, and just really being smart about their finances, right? Not only that, that's only going to continue. So you're not going to get more of this like ATM-like activity, because as rates rise, it simply doesn't make any more sense for people who have already refinanced to pull out any cash from their homes. So there you have it. A little food for thought, and I really would appreciate it if you guys liked and subscribed my channel.